The morning was quiet. Too quiet, perhaps, for the bustling life I had grown used to in my small, sunlit kitchen. I was humming softly to myself, a little tune my own mother used to sing, as I waited for the kettle to whistle. There's a certain rhythm to a kitchen in the early hours, isn't there? The familiar weight of the ceramic mug in my hands, the way the dust motes dance in the golden light hitting the floorboards, and that sweet, earthy scent of tea leaves steeping. My hands, now spotted with age and mapped with silver veins, moved with a mind of their own, stirring memories back to the surface. I looked at the little wooden height marks notched into the pantry door, and for a moment, I wasn't 70 years old. I was back in the chaos of the school years. I could almost see him, my son, standing there with his scraped knees and that messy cowlick that refused to stay down, showing me a school project he'd carefully taped together with more hope than skill. I could hear the echo of his laughter bouncing down these very hallways, a sound that always felt like the heartbeat of this house. He was my pride, my heart, my everything. I lived for the days he'd call just to tell me about a promotion or the funny thing my grandson said at breakfast. My phone vibrated against the granite countertop, the sharp buzz startling me out of my daydream. I picked it up with a smile, my thumb hovering over the screen. I expected a photo of the kids or a cheerful, "Good morning, Mom." Mothers always hope for warmth in the smallest gestures, don't we? But the screen that greeted me was not warm. It was like a sheet of ice. The message read, "Don't come to our house anymore. We want peace." The words struck like a cold, heavy hand pressed against my chest. I couldn't breathe. My hands began to tremble, the phone suddenly feeling like a lead weight. I read it again, squinting through the sudden blur in my eyes. Sure, I had misunderstood. Surely this was a mistake, a text meant for a difficult neighbor or a persistent salesman. But there it was, his name at the top, my own flesh and blood. He wanted peace, as if I had been the war. I sat down slowly on the edge of the kitchen chair, the kettle still whining on the stove, but I didn't have the strength to stand and turn it off. The steam fogged up the window, hiding the world outside, just as the words on my screen had clouded everything I thought I knew about my life. "Peace," he had said. I looked down at my bare wrists, and the memory of what used to be there felt heavier than any jewelry ever could. I remembered the day I walked into that jeweler's shop in town. I had a small velvet pouch tucked into my purse, containing the only things my mother had left me: 3 solid gold bangles that used to chime like bells whenever she reached out to hug me. I didn't hesitate for a second. My son needed his final semester's tuition, and the bank had said no. I watched the jeweler weigh them, the metal of my heritage being traded for a paper check. I did it with a smile, thinking that a mother's job is to build a bridge for her children to cross, even if she has to use her own foundations to do it. And it wasn't just the money. It was the nights I spent sitting by his bed when the fever wouldn't break, my forehead pressed against his, praying for the heat to leave his small body and enter mine. It was the way I defended him when the world was unkind, the way I shouldered his burdens so he could walk tall. You don't keep a tally of these things when you're doing them. Love doesn't use an accountant. But when you're told you're a disturbance to the peace you helped build, those memories start to ache. It's a quiet kind of betrayal, isn't it? It's not a loud argument or a door slammed in the heat of the moment. It's a cold, calculated distance that seeps into your bones, making you wonder if every sacrifice was actually just a brick in a wall they were building against you. I sat there, in the fading steam of the kitchen, feeling a hollow space opening up in my chest, realizing that the boy I had given everything to had grown into a man who thought my love was something he needed to be protected from. The days that followed were like walking through a house where all the clocks had stopped. The world kept moving outside my window. The mailman still whistled as he made his rounds, and the neighbor's dog still barked at the squirrels. But inside my heart, everything was frozen. I found myself standing by the front door, my coat already in my hand, before the weight of that message would hit me all over again. I couldn't go. I wasn't allowed. Usually, by 3 o'clock, I'd be making my way down the sidewalk toward the elementary school. There's a small wooden bench just outside the main gates, weathered by the sun and peeling a bit at the edges. That was my spot. I'd sit there and wait for the bell to ring, my heart leaping when I saw my grandchildren running toward me, their backpacks bouncing like little turtles. I'd listen to their stories, the scraped elbows, the drawings of purple trees, the secrets they only told their Nana. That laughter was my favorite song, a melody I thought would play forever. But now I had to learn a new and painful map of my own neighborhood. I took the long way to the grocery store just to avoid passing their street. I looked away when I saw a car that resembled my son's, my pulse quickening with a mixture of hope and terror. The absence wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a physical weight. I'd look at the little sweaters I had half knitted sitting in the basket by my chair, and I couldn't bring myself to pick up the needles. Every stitch felt like a question with no answer. The silence in my house began to feel like smoke, curling into every corner and making it hard to draw a full breath. I'd find myself setting 3 plates on the table out of habit, only to realize with a jolt that I was only cooking for one. It's a strange thing, isn't it, to be a stranger to the people who are your entire world. I sat on my porch as the sun went down, staring at that empty space on the bench in my mind, wondering how a heart so full of love could suddenly feel so completely hollow. I spent those long, restless nights replaying the past 40 years like a grainy film strip, looking for the moment I had failed. When you're told you aren't wanted, your mind becomes a courtroom, and you're both the prisoner and the judge. I sat in my wingback chair until the embers in the fireplace turned to cold gray ash, asking myself the same questions over and over. Was I too much? Did I crowd them with a love that felt more like a cage than a gift? I thought about the advice I'd given when they bought their first home, and the way I'd shown up with a mop and a bucket before they'd even unpacked a box. I thought it was helpfulness. I thought it was a mother's devotion. But now, in the harsh glare of that text message, I wondered if it felt like an invasion. Had I stepped over lines I didn't even see? Maybe when I brought over those extra groceries or insisted on watching the kids so they could have a date night, I wasn't being the saint I thought I was. Maybe I was just a reminder that they couldn't handle it all on their own. It's a terrifying thing to realize that your best intentions might have been someone else's biggest burden. I remembered the look on my daughter-in-law's face a few months back when I suggested a different way to soothe the baby's colic. At the time, I thought she was just tired. Now I see the tightness in her jaw, the way she turned her back to stir the pot. Was that the beginning of the end? I wondered if my son looked at me and saw not a source of comfort, but a shadow he couldn't escape. The psychological weight of it started to pull at me. I began to doubt the very foundation of my character. Am I the kind, gentle grandmother the neighbors see, or am I a meddling old woman who doesn't know when to let go? The tension grew until I felt like I was vibrating with it. I wanted to call and apologize, to scream, to plead. But for what? For loving them? Or for not knowing how to stop? The sun hadn't quite cleared the horizon when the sound broke through the stillness. It wasn't the sharp, confident knock of a neighbor or the heavy thud of a delivery man. It was a soft, hesitant sound, almost like a heartbeat against the wood of my front door. I stayed still for a moment, my breath catching in my throat, wondering if my mind was finally playing tricks on me after so many days of silence. But then it came again, a second knock, just as uncertain as the first. I stood up, my joints feeling stiff and old, and smoothed my robe with trembling hands. When I pulled the door open, the cool morning air rushed in, and there he was, my son. He was standing on the porch, bathed in that pale, gray light of dawn that hides nothing. My heart wanted to leap out and pull him into a hug, to tell him all was forgiven before he even spoke a word, but something held me back. I stayed rooted to the spot, looking at the man I had raised. He looked diminished. There were deep, dark hollows under his eyes that I hadn't seen before, and his shoulders, usually so broad and square, were slumped as if he were carrying the weight of the world. He hadn't shaved in days, and his jacket was wrinkled like he'd slept in it or hadn't slept at all. He didn't look like a man who had found the peace he claimed to be looking for. He looked like a man who was drowning and had finally realized that the shore was further away than he thought. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us moving, the silence between us thick and heavy. I studied the lines on his forehead, the way he wouldn't quite meet my gaze, and the nervous way his fingers kept twitching at his sides. He looked fragile, like a piece of glass that had already been cracked and was just waiting for the right vibration to shatter. I wanted to reach out, but I remembered the coldness of that text, and for the first time in my life, I waited for him to speak first. I waited to see if he was here for me, or if he was just here because he had nowhere else to go. I stepped aside, letting the silence guide him in. He sat on the edge of the old floral sofa, the one he used to nap on after Sunday dinners, but he looked like a stranger in his own history. His hands were clasped so tight his knuckles were white, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a thin, ragged whisper. "Mom," he started, his eyes fixed on the rug. "We're in trouble. Deep trouble. The business, the house, it's all slipping away." As the words spilled out, the truth began to untangle itself. It wasn't that I was a burden. It was that his pride was a mountain he couldn't climb. He confessed to the mounting debts, the late notices, and the crushing weight of trying to keep up an image of success that was crumbling like dry sand. He told me they had pushed me away because they couldn't bear the thought of me offering to help again. They didn't want my peace. They wanted to hide their shame. They knew that if I walked through their door and saw the empty fridge or the stress etched into their faces, I would have reached for my purse before they could even say hello. It hit me then, a realization so sharp it took my breath away. That text message, that cruel, cold dismissal, had been a shield. He had traded our relationship for the sake of his ego. He thought that by cutting me out, he could keep his failure a secret, as if a mother's heart doesn't already know when her child is hurting. He wanted peace from the guilt of seeing my generosity, a peace that came at the cost of my heartbreak. I looked at him, and for a moment I didn't see the grown man who had rejected me. I saw the little boy who used to hide his broken toys behind his back so I wouldn't see he'd made a mistake. Only this time, the toy was his life, and the stakes were our family. He wasn't looking for a mother, he was looking for a way to stop feeling like a failure. And in that quiet living room, I realized that my love had become a mirror he was too afraid to look into.
I sat there, listening to the clock on the mantel tick-tock, tick-tock, marking the seconds of a life I had spent giving until I was empty. My son looked up at me then, his eyes wet and searching, waiting for me to do what I had always done, to reach out, to stroke his hair, and to tell him I'd find a way to fix it. He was waiting for the bank of mom to open its doors and bail him out of the mess his pride had created. But something had shifted deep inside me during those days of lonely silence. The warmth was still there, but it was tempered now, like steel forged in a fire. I took a slow breath and looked him straight in the eyes. "I hear you," I said, my voice steady and quiet, carrying a weight I hadn't known I possessed. "And my heart breaks for the struggle you're in. But you need to understand something." I leaned forward just a little, not in anger, but with a clarity that felt like the morning sun burning through the fog. I respected your message. I stayed away when it hurt more than I can put into words. But boundaries, son, they have to go both ways. You can't put me on a shelf like an old book and only take me down when you need a reference or a miracle. I am your mother, not your emergency fund. I am not a storage room for your emotional baggage or a safety net for when your pride fails you. He blinked, looking as though I'd slapped him with a velvet glove. The surprise on his face told me everything. He had never seen me as a person with my own needs, only as a resource. If I am not welcome in your home during your times of peace, I continued, then I cannot be the first person you call when your world is at war. Respect is the soil that love grows in. Without it, closeness is just a chore. I love you more than life itself, but I will no longer be used only when it's convenient for you. He lowered his head, and for the first time, the silence in the room wasn't mine to carry, it was his. After he left that morning, the house didn't feel empty anymore, it felt spacious. For the first time in decades, the silence wasn't a waiting room for someone else's needs. It was mine. I decided then and there that I wouldn't spend my days staring at the driveway, hoping for a car to turn in. Instead, I turned toward the things I had neglected while I was busy being everyone else's anchor. I spent those next few weeks in the garden, getting my fingernails dirty and feeling the sun bake into the back of my neck. I pruned the roses that had grown wild and tangled, much like my own life, and realized that sometimes you have to cut away the parts you love to let the whole thing bloom again. I started taking long, wandering walks in the crisp morning air, not to get anywhere, but just to feel my own feet on the earth. I noticed the way the light changed on the hills and how the birds seemed to have a lot more to say when I actually took the time to listen. Inside, I dusted off the books that had sat on my nightstand for years, stories of far-off places and lives I'd never lived. I read until the stars came out, sipping my tea slowly, savoring the heat of the mug without rushing to check the phone. I visited old friends, women who had known me since I was a girl, and we laughed until we cried over things that had nothing to do with children or heartaches. There was still a small, persistent ache in my chest, a soft drumbeat reminding me of the distance between me and my son. But it wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was becoming a part of my landscape, like a mountain in the distance, always there, but not something I had to climb every single day. I was learning that my value didn't depend on being needed. I was learning to be whole all by myself, finding a quiet, steady strength in the simple act of existing for me. I wasn't just a mother or a grandmother anymore. I was a woman, and for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. One rainy Tuesday evening, as I was settling into my chair with a fresh ball of yarn, that familiar vibration hummed against the side table. My heart gave a little instinctive flutter, that old motherly reflex that never quite dies, but I didn't scramble for it this time. I finished my row, laid my needles down, and finally picked up the phone. It was a message from him. Short, hesitant, and stripped of the coldness that had defined our last few weeks. It just said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I handled everything wrong. I miss you." There was a time, not so long ago, when those words would have sent me flying out the door, keys in hand, ready to wrap him in a hug and forget every wound he'd inflicted. My soul ached to do just that. I wanted to hear about the grandkids, to know if he was eating well, and to feel like the center of his world again. But as I looked at those glowing letters on the screen, I realized that rushing back would only be rebuilding the same fragile bridge that had collapsed before. If I didn't hold my ground now, the peace he'd asked for would just become a recurring weapon. I sat with the message for a long time, letting the rain drum against the windowpane. I had to choose between the comfort of the old way and the dignity of the new one. I realized that missing someone isn't a cure for disrespect, it's just a symptom of the distance. So, I took a deep breath and typed carefully, my heart heavy but my hands steady. I wrote, "I love you more than words can say, but respect must come before closeness. When you are ready to build a relationship based on that, my door is open. No more, and no less." It was the hardest thing I've ever had to send. Every fiber of my being wanted to add, "P.S. I've made your favorite cookies," but I didn't. I hit send and set the phone face down. I wasn't being cruel, I was being honest. I was teaching him, and reminding myself, that my love is a gift, not a right. I went back to my knitting, the clicking of the needles the only sound in the room, knowing that a bridge built on truth is the only one strong enough to carry us both. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, the seasons began to shift, mirroring the change within my own soul. I used to believe that a mother's love had to be a bottomless well, an endless resource that never asked for anything in return. But I see now that love without limits is like a river without banks, it just turns into a swamp that swallows everything whole. True love, the kind that lasts and heals, has to be measured. It has to be wise. It has to know when to hold tight and, more importantly, when to let go. I stepped out onto my porch as the evening sky began to catch fire, spilling deep ambers and soft violets across the horizon. I didn't feel the old, familiar tug of anxiety wondering why the phone hadn't rung. I didn't feel that hollow ache of waiting for someone else to tell me I was worthy of their time. For the first time in my long life, I felt truly at peace, not because my son had changed, though we were slowly finding our way back to each other on new terms, but because I had changed. I had found a freedom I never knew existed, the freedom from needing to be needed. I realized that my dignity wasn't something he could give me or take away with a text message. It was a quiet strength I carried inside me all along, just waiting for the noise to stop so I could finally hear it. I watched the sun dip below the trees, the gold light fading into a calm, steady twilight. I poured myself a final cup of tea, the steam rising to meet the cool air, and I smiled. My house was quiet, yes, but it wasn't lonely. It was full of my own thoughts, my own strength, and a love for myself that I'd finally stopped giving away for free. The message that had once broken my heart had ended up being the key that unlocked it. I took a sip of my tea, leaned back in my chair, and watched the first star appear. I was okay. I was more than okay. I was finally home.